Welcome back to Grace to Endure. So in this video, we're actually going to learn about the end. And we hear this term used all the time. People talk about the end of the world. In this video, we're going to look at a biblical view of what that looks like, the sights and the sounds, the Christian responses, and what the world is going to be doing. Now, in previous videos, we've already seen the beginning of the end, and we have seen that it's when the world is going to start having certain signs that are going to be recognizable, but we've also seen it's not appropriate to say that Jesus is at the door at this time. In fact, the correct Christian response is to meet more for church, to be hospitable, to encourage each other to love and good works, and to endure this next period of time, which is the middle of the end, the Great Tribulation, which the Bible has described as worse than any other time on the face of the earth, worse than ever has been or ever will be again. And it is described also as Satan's fury at God's church. So then, today we're going to look at what happens immediately after this time of great tribulation. It's the end and the beginning of what is called the day of the Lord. It's such a prominent time in history that God actually calls it his day. We're going to look at, is it one day or is it a series of days? So what is the day of the Lord? What's it going to be like? And what should we do about it? What should be our mindset ahead of time before it happens? How can we be ready? And how can we have the right response? How can we be watchful in an appropriate and knowledgeable way? Turn with me to Matthew 24, verse 29, and here we're going to pick up and we're going to read this description that is astonishing. It says immediately after the tribulation, so no delay of time after the great tribulation, and this is going to happen. Verse 29, immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not shed its light. The stars will fall from the sky. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. Okay, so let's pause everything for just a minute because verse 30 is Jesus returning. But then in verse 32, the author steps back and says, okay, so let's learn this again. I'm going to show you through an illustration with a fig tree how you can know that Jesus is about to return. So let's read in verse 32. Learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its branches become tender and sprout leaves, you know that summer is near. Okay, so look on the left side of the screen. You see a fig tree. It's got leaves. And so this equals the knowledge that summer is near, which means that a fig tree is going to start producing fruit. Okay, so let's keep reading in verse 33. In the same way, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near at the door. So, from the text, what are all these things that we have just seen? Well, if you look on the left side of the screen, you see we've seen the beginning of birth pangs. So the labor pains have started at that point, and they're starting to intensify slowly. And then we've gotten to the tribulation. The labor pains have gotten so horrible, it is hard to even endure. You don't even know how you could, in fact. And then the sign in the sun, moon, and stars. The stars start falling from the sky. That's a pretty significant sign. The sun stops shining. Everything goes pitch black. And the moon stops shedding its light. It's hard to miss this sign. No one will miss this sign. So then, just like a midwife who is helping a woman who's travailing in labor, and when she's gone through all these things, those beginning pains that aren't so bad, and then as they intensify, and then the great time in the middle that is full of so much pain she doesn't know how to endure. It is so hard just to get through it. And then it comes time for the midwife to say, okay, let's get into position. New life is about to occur. So it is with us. As it turns out, we have a correct position, we could say, or correct Christian response to the return of the King. Let's find out what that is. So in Matthew 24, verse 30, Jesus is returning. And before we touch on that verse, I actually want to pause yet one more time and draw our attention to this delay of time that's mentioned repeatedly. And I'm going to show you some of those verses. And you might think, why are you taking so long to get to the punchline of Jesus' return? And the reason for that is I'm actually trying to teach you something. I'm trying to teach you that sometimes there's a delay when you don't expect it. And I don't know when this delay is going to happen. I don't know if this delay of time is just referring to the time between when Jesus ascended into heaven and his return, and how, some may not have expected it to be that long of a delay, or if it's talking about after the sun, moon, and stars, do their signs. When the sun stops shining, it doesn't say how long it stops shining for. I'm not sure. But I want to show two things. Let's look at verse 37. As in the days of Noah were, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. For in those days, before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah boarded the ark. They didn't know until the flood came and swept them away. This is the way the coming of the Son of Man will be. So people are going to be eating and drinking and carrying on with life. I don't know if you could do that if the sun has gone completely black. I don't know. Maybe, perhaps. But then in verse 42, we're told to stay alert. Then I want to show you then in verse 45. Who then is the faithful and wise servant who the master puts in charge of his household, to bring them food at the proper time? His household. God's household is the church, right? So there is going to be a time where it is the proper time to give food to the church, and there's masters that have been put in charge, and they have the food that they need, and they're giving them allotted amounts, okay? Notice right here in verse 48, it says, but if that wicked servant says in his heart, my master is delayed, and so he starts to beat the servants, and then it goes on, that's not okay. They're not allowed to beat them, okay? And interestingly, there's this little delay talked about. The master's delayed. Something, maybe a delay at an unexpected time is what I'm trying to show us, okay? And then if you look at the virgins, the parable of the 10 virgins in chapter 25, let's look right here in verse 5. When the groom was delayed, they became drowsy and fell asleep. So once again, we see this idea of delay. Before we get started with the contents of this particular screen, I want to look at Joel chapter 2, verse 31. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. So according to this passage, the signs in the sun, moon, and stars is not quite the day of the Lord. It's not what starts the day of the Lord. It is just before it, it would seem. So we want to keep that straight in our minds. The day of the Lord starts after it. Now, let's look at what our commands are here. We've already seen in Matthew 24, verse 33, that when we see all these signs, the beginning of birth pangs, the tribulation, and then the sun, moon, and stars having their signs of going dark, that we know that the day of the Lord is near. Okay? So we know his coming is near. We know he's at the door at that particular time when we've seen all these things. Okay? So then let's look at James chapter 5. And I want to look at these distinct commands that we are told to do when Jesus is specifically near and at the door, but not quite there yet. Strengthen your hearts because the Lord's coming is near. Brothers and sisters, do not complain about one another so that you will not be judged. Look, the judge stands at the door. Brothers and sisters, take the prophets who spoke in the Lord's name as an example of suffering and patience. So what are we going to need? We need to strengthen our hearts. We need to not grumble and complain at each other. And we need to see that we have these examples in the Old Testament of suffering and patience. And it goes on to give the example of Job. and that we see the outcome of Job's life in the end. And so we need to remember that while we perhaps wait, because we don't know exactly the day or exactly the hour of the Lord's coming. Okay, so enough about that. Now let's look at the contents of this screen. I'm going to give a brief overview of what's in these verses that are in yellow. I'm going to go over what Jesus will do, what the unbelievers will do, and what the believers will do. So let's start with what Jesus will do on the left side of the screen. He will cause outrageous destruction by fire. In fact, the whole earth is going to melt, and it describes this in detail in these passages. And we must remember, just a quick warning, the Antichrist causes the abomination, which causes desolation. And so the first one to cause some desolation of the earth, remember, even if he claims that he is fulfilling these verses, he's not. He's the lawless one. The one that comes and destroys the entire earth and judges in complete finality, that is Jesus. Okay, so let's keep going. He is going to come. Jesus is going to come with a massive and powerful army. And then he's going to punish the world for its evil. He's going to punish wicked people for their iniquities. He's going to put an end to the pride of the arrogant, and he's going to humiliate the tyrants. Okay, look on the right side of the screen. What is the response when the heavens start to shake and Jesus is returning? The Lamb of God is coming. What's the response of the unbelievers? They lose heart. They're horrified. They're terrified. They look at each other. Their faces are flushed with fear. They run to the mountains and they hide in the cliffs and in the rocks, and they are scared to death of the wrath of God. They are terrified. Now, what is supposed to be our correct response to the day of the Lord? It's the exact opposite. It says, look up, stand. We are to love this day. We have been longing for it, and it will finally be here. So we are not to get all caught up in this command and think, oh, that means we have to actually be standing. No, that's not the point. The point is in contrast to the unbelievers who are running in fear. Instead, we are looking up with love, because finally what we've longed for is coming to pass. Our Redeemer is here and our redemption has come. Now I want to focus on the question, is the day of the Lord one day or many days? So in order to answer this, I need to explain a few things. So the early church fathers, many of whom were specifically taught by John, who wrote Revelation himself, they believed and taught that the creation week, which was 6 days, and then on the seventh day God rested, it was a holy day, right? They believed that that was a picture of a 7,000-year plan. Now, if you look up at the screen, that's what this means. It's 1,000, 2,000. That's around the flood right there. And then you have Old Testament time period, and then you see the cross. Jesus died around 33 AD. Okay, and then we've had the 5,000 and 6,000 year time frame, and then the early church fathers believed that the 7,000th year, that was going to be the millennial kingdom, which is something you can read in Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 10. And I'd love for you to go and read that, and you'll see that there is something described as this 1,000-year reign of Jesus being on the earth. And so the early church fathers believed that that was when Jesus was going to come, and he was going to set up his kingdom on earth for 1,000 years. And those that don't take the mark of the beast, literal Christians who come out of the tribulation, they don't take the mark of the beast, and they don't compromise on the gospel. They are killed during the tribulation, and they rise at that time, and they actually rule and reign with Christ, okay, for exactly 1,000 years. So I actually agree with the early church fathers that the last days is talking about day 5 and 6, or you could also say years, the 5,000s and the 6,000s, and that the 7,000th year is yet to come. So you can see where we are in history. Of course, we're getting very close to that last 7-year time frame that the Bible references as being the last days or last years of human history before Jesus comes and sets up his kingdom. So to answer the question, I believe the day of the Lord is actually referring to that seventh day of creation picture, and that's why it says day, but it's actually 1,000 years.